The first thing Ethan Caldwell noticed was not the smell of smoke, but the silence. At 2:13 in the morning, the kind of silence that usually belonged only to dead winter nights wrapped around his property like something deliberate, unnatural, as if even the wind had stepped back to watch what was about to happen. Then came the crack, sharp, violent, unmistakable, the sound of old timber splitting under heat. By the time he reached the hallway, orange light was already crawling beneath his bedroom door. Flames moved faster than thought, racing through the cedar beams his father had installed 30 years earlier, with his own hands devouring framed photographs, bookshelves, and the handwritten notes Ethan had kept boxed in the study ever since he returned to this quiet California neighborhood 6 months ago. Outside, the alarm screamed into darkness, but no porch lights came on. No neighbors opened their doors. No one shouted his name. Barefoot on the freezing floor, Ethan grabbed only one thing before the ceiling above the kitchen collapsed, the metal document case hidden beneath his desk, the one containing legal drafts, annotated statutes, and old legislative notes no one alive should have cared about anymore. He barely made it through the back door before the front windows exploded outward in a shower of sparks. Across the street, under the weak yellow glow of a street lamp, a black SUV idled for 1 second too long. Ethan saw the driver's silhouette turn toward him before the vehicle rolled away without headlights. He knew that shape. He had seen that car parked outside HOA meetings every Thursday evening in front of the clubhouse where Margaret Holloway liked to remind residents that order was the price of community. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood on his porch in a cream coat holding a clipboard like a weapon, telling him his refusal to join Willow Creek Homeowners Association would eventually have consequences. He had answered by quoting the exact subsection of California Residential Code that protected his parcel from mandatory inclusion. She had smiled then, not angry, not surprised, just patient, as if she were waiting for him to learn how expensive being right could become. Now Ethan stood in the wet grass wearing only sweatpants and ash, watching the house. His parents' built collapse inward while the fire department arrived 11 minutes too late for a district with a station less than 4 miles away. One firefighter avoided his eyes. Another asked whether anyone else had been inside. Ethan said no, but his attention stayed fixed on the burning porch where his father's old mailbox finally fell into the flames. Then Margaret appeared at the edge of the crowd in a dark umbrella, perfectly dressed dry despite the rain, her expression composed enough to look almost sympathetic. "Terrible tragedy," she said softly, as if speaking at a funeral. Ethan looked at her, smoke rising between them, and for the first time since moving back he understood that this had never been about a mailbox or a fence or unpaid HOA notices. Someone had just burned down the wrong man's house, and they had no idea he was one of the people who had written the laws they had already broken. By sunrise, nothing remained of Ethan Caldwell's house except the stone chimney part of the back foundation and a blackened frame where his father's workshop had once stood. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the entire property wrapped in a cold, gray mist that made the ruins look unreal, like a photograph from someone else's life. Fire investigators moved through the wreckage with practiced detachment, stepping over soaked beams and collapsed roofing, while 2 patrol officers stood near the road pretending not to notice Margaret Holloway, speaking quietly with Assistant Fire Marshal Dean Mercer beside a county vehicle. Ethan sat on the tailgate of an ambulance he had refused to ride in a thermal blanket over his shoulders, the metal document case beside him like the only surviving witness that still belonged to him. Inside that case were old legislative drafts, archived legal correspondence, and one leather folder containing his annotated commentary on homeowner association enforcement law documents he had not touched in years because they belonged to a former life, one he had buried after Claire died, and after the kind of grief that makes every professional victory feel obscene. He had returned to this inherited house precisely because it was supposed to be outside the machinery of ambition and conflict, a forgotten parcel his father purchased before Willow Creek even existed, exempt by deed language older than the subdivision itself. Margaret had known that from the beginning. The first certified letter arrived 4 days after he moved in notice of non-compliance landscaping violation, mailbox inconsistency, exterior, color conflict. The second included late fees. The third came with a warning that refusal to cooperate with community governance would lead to escalating administrative consequences. Ethan answered every letter with statute numbers, county plat maps, and legal citations so precise that by the fourth exchange, Margaret stopped pretending the dispute was administrative and came to his porch herself. She had stood there, smiling, hands folded, telling him communities functioned only when everyone agreed to belong. He had replied that forced membership outside recorded covenants was illegal. Her smile had hardened just enough for him to understand that she was unused to hearing the word illegal from someone who could explain exactly why. Now, while the ashes of his home still steamed, Dean Mercer finally approached holding a clipboard and said, "Preliminary signs suggest electrical origin, possibly overloaded line near the rear wall." Ethan looked toward the rear wall that no longer existed and asked why the breaker box had been opened before the fire spread. Mercer blinked. What Ethan stood, blankets slipping from his shoulders. The breaker box cover was removed before ignition. I saw it hanging when I came out the back door. Mercer glanced too quickly toward Margaret, then wrote something down without answering. That glance told Ethan more than the report ever would. A county deputy soon handed him a temporary incident summary and advised him not to remain on site after dark because the structure was unsafe. Unsafe, Ethan thought, as though the danger had not already arrived, wearing polished shoes and carrying HOA authority. By mid-morning, an insurance adjuster named Linda Parson arrived earlier than expected, too early for a total loss case filed less than 7 hours prior. She walked the perimeter, took photographs, and asked him whether he had recently modified any wiring. No. Used portable heaters, num. Any candles? Num. She nodded with professional sympathy, but never once asked about suspicious activity, not even after he mentioned the SUV parked across the street during the fire. When she left, she promised an expedited review. By noon, he received an email stating that preliminary evidence indicated probable owner negligence, pending full assessment. Owner negligence. Less than 10 hours after his house burned. Ethan opened the message twice, then laughed once, short, humorless, because the speed of it revealed planning. Across the street, curtains shifted in neighboring homes. Nobody came over. Nobody offered coffee or blankets or questions. Fear sat heavier than smoke in Willow Creek. Around 1 in the afternoon, an elderly woman finally crossed the road carrying a thermos and 2 paper cups. She wore gardening gloves and moved like someone who expected to be watched. "I'm Helen Mercer," she said quietly, not related to the fire marshal despite the name. Lot 12. Ethan accepted the coffee. "Thank you." She looked toward Margaret's clubhouse 2 blocks away before lowering her voice. "You shouldn't have stayed alone last night after the board meeting." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What board meeting?" Helen hesitated, then said, "Emergency executive session. Margaret called 5 board members in after sunset. That black SUV was parked outside until nearly midnight." "Why tell me now?" Helen's hands tightened around the thermos. "Because 20 years ago my husband tried to fight them when they took half our easement for their private gate extension. He died before court. Heart attack officially. But fear can kill people too." Before Ethan could ask more, Helen noticed movement near the road and stepped back immediately. Margaret was approaching again, dressed now in pale gray, carrying a folder under one arm as though visiting a client. "Mrs. Mercer," Margaret said warmly, "I'm sure Ethan needs rest." Helen muttered goodbye and retreated without finishing her coffee. Margaret stopped 2 feet from Ethan and looked at the ruins as if evaluating renovation potential. "The board held an emergency vote this morning," she said. "Given the hazard, we're requiring debris removal within 72 hours. The remains violate neighborhood safety standards." Ethan stared at her. "My house burned 12 hours ago." Exactly why prompt action matters. She handed him the folder. Inside was a formal notice stamped with HOA letterhead and legal language clearly copied from templates never intended for exempt parcels. You don't have jurisdiction over this land. Your land affects community value. You burned my house. For the first time, her expression changed, not with guilt, but offense, as if he had broken etiquette. Careful, Ethan. Grief makes accusations dangerous. So does arson. She leaned slightly closer. You refused every opportunity to cooperate. Communities remember who refuses them. Then she turned and walked away before he could answer heels, clicking against wet pavement. Ethan watched her leave, then opened the metal document case on the hood of his truck. The leather folder inside still smelled faintly of smoke. He flipped past legislative committee drafts until he found the chapter on non-covenanted parcels and emergency enforcement abuse. His own handwriting filled the margins from years earlier, warnings about precisely this kind of overreach notes written during long nights in Sacramento when lobbyists tried to weaken homeowner protections for private associations hungry for power. He had fought then to keep one clause intact: no association may impose penalties, access restrictions, or safety enforcement against exempt recorded property without municipal authorization. Margaret had already violated that clause repeatedly. Burning the house, if provable, would move this far beyond civil law. But proof required evidence, and evidence vanished quickly when local officials were willing to look away. He closed the folder and walked through the perimeter tape until he reached what remained of the utility post behind the house. The breaker box hung open exactly as he remembered, warped by heat, but still visible. One screw lay in the mud several feet away, not melted into place, meaning it had been removed before the fire reached peak temperature. He crouched, using a pen to lift it carefully into an evidence envelope from his truck's glove compartment, a habit from old legal instincts he thought he had abandoned. Near the back fence, he found something else half buried in ash, a torn black fabric strip with reflective stitching, the kind used inside industrial work gloves. Not his. He sealed that too. When he stood again, he noticed a small dome camera mounted on the neighboring garage behind the alley line. Lot 9. He walked there immediately and knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Finally, a teenage boy opened the side door halfway. "Your parents home?" Ethan asked. "Mom said we're not supposed to talk. Your camera points toward my backyard." The boy hesitated, then whispered, "They came here early this morning. Who? A man from the board. Took our Wi-Fi box for inspection because of network interference." Before Ethan could press further, a woman's voice from inside snapped the door shut. Ethan stepped back slowly. They were already collecting anything that might have seen too much. That evening, he erected a camping chair beside the ruins because he refused to leave the property. Around sunset, county code enforcement arrived with another notice: temporary habitation prohibited. He signed receipt but did not move. Darkness returned colder than before. Across the street, lights glowed warmly behind closed curtains, while his own land smelled of wet ash and cedar ghosts. At 9:17 p.m., a pickup truck rolled slowly past without headlights. Ethan memorized the plate before it disappeared. At 9:43, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. No voice when he answered, only breathing, then a click. At 10:06, he opened the leather folder again beneath a battery lantern and found an old business card tucked inside from someone he had not spoken to in 8 years. Rachel Monroe, investigative reporter. Written on the back in his late wife Claire's handwriting were 4 words: "If truth matters, call her." Ethan stared at the card while wind moved ash across the ground like gray snow. Then, from the darkness near the mailbox, ruins came a soft crunch of footsteps. He stood instantly. Helen Mercer emerged again, coat wrapped tight, carrying something under her arm. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered, handing him a flash drive. "Board secretary dropped it near the clubhouse this morning." "What is it? I don't know." But Margaret looked terrified when she couldn't find it. Before he could thank her, headlights appeared at the road and Helen vanished back into darkness faster than her age should have allowed. Ethan looked down at the flash drive in his hand, then toward the approaching car. It was Dean Mercer again, alone this time, stepping out with a face too serious for routine procedure. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I need to inform you officially because of findings from the preliminary scene review. Your insurance claim may be suspended pending possible negligence investigation." Ethan slipped the flash drive into his pocket. Negligence based on what Mercer hesitated. "Accelerant traces near the rear wall." Ethan held his gaze. "That's interesting because someone opened my breaker box before ignition." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You should be careful what you say. You should be careful what report you sign." For 1 second, the fire marshal looked less like an official and more like a man trapped inside a bad decision. Then he returned to his car without another word. Ethan watched the taillights disappear, pulled out the flash drive, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever had started in Willow Creek was no longer about recovering a burned house. It was about exposing a machine that believed fear had already won. And somewhere inside that tiny piece of plastic, Margaret Holloway might have just lost control of the fire she started. Ethan Caldwell did not wait until morning. At 11:14 p.m., seated in a folding chair beside the ruins of his house with a battery lantern casting pale light across the ash, he inserted Helen Mercer's flash drive into the old laptop he had charged from his truck inverter. For 3 full seconds, nothing appeared except a blank directory, and then a hidden folder opened automatically. Board_minutes_private security_archive legal_correspondence. Whoever had copied the files either knew exactly what mattered or had stolen them in panic. The first document was an executive session agenda dated the previous night, stamped confidential under the letterhead of Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Item 1 read, "Caldwell Parcel Escalation and Compliance Resolution." Item 2, Insurance Coordination. Item 3, Emergency Structural Outcome Strategy. Ethan read that line twice slower the second time, because no legitimate HOA used the phrase structural outcome strategy 12 hours before a house burned. He opened the attached audio file. Static crackled, followed by voices around a long table. Margaret Holloway's voice came first, calm and precise. "He refuses every administrative route. He cites statutes because he thinks paper protects him." Another male voice. Board Treasurer Colin Reeves answered nervously. "If he files county challenge, we lose authority over all exempt parcels," Margaret replied. "Then he must become an example before others remember they have choices." Someone laughed softly. Another voice asked, "And Mercer?" Margaret answered, "Dean understands timing matters." Ethan froze, their eyes fixed on the screen while smoke smells still lingered in the keyboard from the fire. Timing matters. It was not confession, not yet, but it was enough to show conspiracy breathing beneath official language. Then he opened security_archive. Several exported camera clips appeared corrupted except one from 1:46 a.m., the alley behind his property. Grainy black and white footage showed a figure in reflective gloves entering through the rear fence, carrying what looked like a small canister. At 1:52, the same figure exited quickly, face hidden by hood, and climbed into a black SUV. Ethan enlarged the plate frame, but the angle blurred the number. Still, the SUV shape matched what he saw during the fire. He copied every file to 2 backup drives before dawn, then made the first call he had avoided making for years. Rachel Monroe answered on the 4th ring voice, tired but sharp. "You call after midnight. It's either scandal or regret." "Possibly both," Ethan said. Silence followed, then recognition. "Ethan Caldwell. I need you in Willow Creek before sunrise. That bad." He looked at the ruins around him. They burned my house and filed paperwork before the smoke cleared. Rachel arrived just after 7 in the morning, driving a dented silver sedan with newsroom decals peeling from the doors. She stepped out wearing jeans boots and the expression of someone who trusted evidence more than outrage. "Claire once told me you only called when something was worth breaking," she said quietly. And for a second, Ethan felt the old ache of hearing his wife's name spoken by someone who remembered her alive. He handed Rachel the laptop. She reviewed the files in silence, jaw tightening only when Margaret's voice emerged from the audio recording. "This alone won't convict arson," she said, "but it destroys the innocent neighborhood board image." "There's more," Ethan answered, showing her the glove fabric screw from the breaker box and timeline from the delayed fire response. Rachel looked toward the clubhouse down the road. "Then they're either reckless or convinced nobody here will testify. So far, they're right." Before Rachel could respond, two black sedans entered the street. One stopped near the property, and a man in a navy suit stepped out holding a leather folder. Behind him came Margaret Holloway, herself composed as always, sunglasses hiding her eyes despite the cloud cover. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said formally. "I'm Daniel Pierce, counsel for Willow Creek, HOA. Effective immediately, you are being served notice of civil action for defamation, interference with community governance, and unlawful possession of private association records." Rachel laughed once under her breath. That was fast. Daniel handed over papers. Margaret remained silent until Ethan finished scanning the first page. "You're suing me while my house is still smoking?" he asked. Margaret removed her sunglasses. "You obtained confidential materials unlawfully and have already made verbal accusations to residents. Residents who watched your board meet before my house caught fire." Daniel stepped in quickly. "Any further defamatory statements will increase damages." Ethan read the complaint more carefully and almost smiled. They had filed in county civil court under emergency injunctive request asking the judge to prohibit him from distributing internal HOA material and from remaining on site because the lot posed public danger. Too aggressive, too hurried, which meant fear had already entered Margaret's strategy. "You made a mistake," Ethan said. Daniel frowned. "Excuse me?" Ethan tapped page 3. "You cited community covenant enforcement under Article 9, Section 4. My parcel is exempt under County Plat Exemption 11B, which voids your standing before you even reach injunctive review." Daniel glanced at Margaret, who did not move. Ethan continued, voice colder now. "And because you filed knowingly against exempt property, that complaint qualifies as retaliatory misuse under state residential protection statute." Rachel watched Margaret closely and saw the first crack small, but there. Margaret recovered immediately. "You always did enjoy legal theater, didn't you?" Ethan looked up. "You should have learned who you were threatening before you lit the match." Daniel's expression changed. "What does that mean?" Ethan folded the papers carefully. "It means the wording in your complaint is copied from a statute I drafted 13 years ago in Sacramento when lobbyists like your clients begged to remove the retaliation clause." Rachel turned toward Daniel. "You might want to look up his legislative authorship before filing amendments." Daniel's confidence slipped visibly. Margaret, however, simply said, "Court tomorrow morning. We'll see what survives under oath." Then she walked back to her sedan. By 10:30, Rachel had already uploaded a controlled preliminary article to her paper's site. Local HOA accused of overreach after house fire raises legal questions. She withheld the audio for now, wanting courtroom timing. By noon, the article spread through county legal circles because Ethan Caldwell's name still carried weight among attorneys old enough to remember reform hearings years earlier. At 1:15, his insurance company called again, claim formally suspended pending investigation. At 2, county code enforcement delivered a second warning threatening municipal cleanup charges if debris remained after 72 hours. At 3, Helen Mercer returned, trembling, saying 2 board members had knocked on her door, asking whether she had spoken to reporters. "They knew I crossed the street yesterday," she whispered. "Did you tell them anything?" Ethan asked. I said, "I'm old, not blind." Rachel immediately recorded her statement, though Helen refused camera. By evening, Ethan and Rachel sat in the truck reviewing case structure like wartime logistics. "Tomorrow they expect you emotional," Rachel said. "Angry homeowner, unstable after loss." Ethan nodded. "So tomorrow I give them statutory precision." He opened his leather folder and began building a courtroom packet, parcel deeds, exemption maps, legislative commentary timestamps, audio transcript, excerpts, incident report, inconsistencies, insurance, denial, chronology. Rachel watched him shift fully into the man he used to be, voice calmer, posture straighter, grief converting into dangerous clarity. "You miss this?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused before answering. "No. But I remember how power panics when someone reads the fine print." The county courthouse next morning smelled of old paper and stale air conditioning. Margaret arrived with Daniel Pierce and 2 board members dressed like civic volunteers attending charity hearings. Ethan wore a charcoal jacket Rachel had bought at dawn because his own wardrobe still smelled of smoke. The courtroom filled more than expected residents, reporters, county clerks, curious enough to linger. Judge Miriam Torres entered precisely at 9 and immediately noticed the urgency motions stacked too thick for a simple HOA dispute. Daniel began by painting Ethan as a hostile outsider, undermining neighborhood governance, unlawfully accessing protected records, and endangering public order by occupying hazardous fire remains. He spoke smoothly, but too quickly. Then Ethan rose without counsel. "Your Honor, before standing is argued. I request dismissal for lack of jurisdiction and sanctions for retaliatory filing against exempt recorded property." Judge Torres adjusted her glasses. "You are representing yourself, for now. Proceed." Ethan handed up the deed map first. Parcel 11B predates Willow Creek Incorporation. HOA authority does not attach. Plaintiff knew this because they cited my exemption in prior violation notices attached to Exhibit C. Daniel's face tightened as the judge read. Ethan continued, voice steady. Second, plaintiff filed emergency injunctive relief under Article 9 language void where no covenant relationship exists. Third filing occurred less than 12 hours after my home burned while plaintiff simultaneously issued private debris enforcement notices unsupported by municipal authority. Judge Torres looked directly at Margaret for the first time. "Mrs. Holloway, did your board issue enforcement notice on exempt land?" Daniel tried to answer, but the judge lifted a hand. Margaret stood. "We acted for community safety." Ethan immediately placed the HOA notice beside state code. "State law forbids private associations from declaring emergency safety jurisdiction absent municipal designation. I authored that revision in committee after prior abuse cases." A murmur moved through the room. Daniel visibly lost rhythm. Judge Torres read Ethan's legislative authorship annotation and looked back again now with sharper interest. "Mr. Caldwell, you wrote this section. Co-authored final enforcement language, yes." Rachel, seated in back row, saw 3 reporters begin typing at once. Daniel attempted recovery by claiming Ethan illegally possessed confidential HOA material. Ethan answered before the judge asked. Then plaintiff should explain why confidential board minutes reference insurance coordination and structural outcome strategy hours before my residence ignited. He handed over transcript excerpts, but withheld the full audio until admissibility could be challenged. Daniel objected instantly. Margaret did not, because for one fatal second she understood the words were already in the judge's hands. Judge Torres leaned back slowly, eyes moving between pages, then said the sentence that shifted the room entirely. "This matter is no longer limited to injunctive relief. I am referring potential evidence irregularities to county review and denying plaintiff's emergency request pending evidentiary hearing." Daniel protested. "Denied." Margaret remained motionless, but Rachel saw her fingers tighten around the edge of counsel table hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited. Ethan stepped through courthouse doors into bright noon light while reporters shouted questions. Margaret exited separately, avoiding microphones until Rachel called loudly. "Mrs. Holloway, why did your board discuss structural outcomes before Mr. Caldwell's house burned?" Margaret stopped only once, turned slightly, and said, "Careful what you publish, Ms. Monroe. Half-truths destroy lives." Rachel answered, "That line usually comes before full truths do." Margaret left without another word. Ethan looked across the courthouse plaza and noticed Dean Mercer standing near the far steps, watching everything, pale and visibly sweating despite the cool air. Their eyes met for one brief second before Mercer turned away. And in that second, Ethan understood the legal battle had just forced the first weak link in Margaret's machine to realize that silence was becoming more dangerous than confession. 3 days after Judge Miriam Torres denied the emergency injunction, the county courthouse no longer felt like a local civil venue. It felt like a pressure chamber waiting for something explosive to rupture. By 8:30 that morning, every seat in Department 4 was filled. Residents from Willow Creek arrived in cautious silence, some pretending curiosity, others carrying years of private resentment they had never dared voice, while Willow Creek Homeowners Association ruled their neighborhood like an unelected government. 2 regional reporters had joined Rachel Monroe, and even clerks from adjacent courtrooms drifted in because word had spread that the homeowner suing his HOA had once helped draft the very statutes now turning the case upside down. Ethan Caldwell stood at the defense table with no theatrical gestures, only a thick binder of exhibits, the smoke-stained leather folder beside it, and the same calm expression he had worn years earlier in legislative hearings when lobbyists tried to bury protections beneath amendments no ordinary homeowner would ever read. Across from him, Margaret Holloway appeared immaculate in dark navy posture, rigid. Her attorney, Daniel Pierce, visibly less polished than before, because overnight filings had forced him to answer not just for HOA authority, but for possible evidence tampering, retaliatory enforcement, and obstruction tied to the fire investigation. The hearing had expanded after Judge Torres formally admitted preliminary county review into the record. Fire Marshal Dean Mercer had been subpoenaed. So had HOA Treasurer Colin Reeves. Margaret had not expected either to become uncertain. Ethan noticed that immediately when Mercer entered his tie, crooked face drained, carrying a file too tightly in both hands like a shield he no longer trusted. Judge Torres opened the session with controlled precision. This hearing concerns plaintiffs' standing alleged retaliatory conduct and newly introduced evidence related to property destruction and administrative misconduct. Mr. Pierce, proceed. Daniel stood attempted confidence and argued that all HOA actions were lawful emergency responses to a dangerous fire scene, that confidential records had been unlawfully obtained, and that speculative interpretations of internal board language were being weaponized by a homeowner motivated by personal hostility. It sounded orderly for 6 minutes until Judge Torres asked the question Daniel feared most. Why did your board issue enforcement notices before municipal fire inspection concluded? Daniel began citing community safety language, but Ethan rose and requested permission to cross using documentary sequence. Granted. He approached the evidence monitor and projected the timeline he had assembled overnight. 1:13 a.m. emergency board call logged. 1:46 a.m. Alley footage showing unidentified entry behind his property. 2:13 a.m. ignition reported. 2:19 a.m. HOA. Internal message marked outcome active. 7:42 a.m. debris enforcement drafted. 8:03 a.m. insurance contact initiated. The room became still enough that paper movement sounded loud. Plaintiff called this safety administration, Ethan said evenly, but the board discussed structural outcomes before fire crews completed suppression. They contacted insurance before investigators completed entry, and they filed legal action before county ownership standing was reviewed. Judge Torres turned to Margaret. Mrs. Holloway, did your board authorize communication with insurance providers regarding Mr. Caldwell's loss? Margaret answered carefully. Only to protect community interests where uninsured hazards affect neighborhood value. Ethan immediately lifted a printed email from the flash drive. Then why did this email from your board treasurer to my insurer state? Quote, owner has history of refusing compliance and may attempt exaggerated claims sent at 6:11 a.m. Before daylight. Daniel objected. Overruled. Colin Reeves, seated behind counsel, visibly swallowed hard. Judge Torres called him forward. Reeves took the witness chair like a man already regretting every prior loyalty. Under oath, he first tried restraint, saying he acted under board instruction, standard precaution, administrative necessity. Ethan asked one question that changed everything. Mr. Reeves, who dictated that email. Silence stretched. Margaret stared straight ahead, not at him. Reeves looked once toward her, then toward Judge Torres, and whatever fear had held him for years finally collided with the fact that perjury now carried more weight than HOA politics. Margaret did, he said quietly. Daniel shut his eyes for half a second. A murmur swept the courtroom. Ethan did not pause. Did Mrs. Holloway attend a board meeting the night before my house burned? Yes. Was my property discussed? Reeves nodded. Was the phrase, remove the problem permanently, used? Daniel objected again. Lack of foundation. Ethan responded by requesting audio excerpt authentication. Judge Torres allowed limited playback. Rachel Monroe handed the court technician the clipped file. Margaret's own voice filled the room through the speakers, calm and unmistakable. He refuses every administrative route. Then he must become an example before others remember they have choices. Another voice asked, and if he still resists? Then a pause followed by the line that froze every face present. Then we remove the problem permanently. No one moved after the audio ended. Daniel stood halfway uncertain whether objections still mattered after hearing his client's own words amplified through county speakers. Margaret finally spoke, voice sharper than before. That statement referred to legal removal, not violence. Ethan answered immediately. Then why was Fire Marshal Mercer contacted 41 minutes after that meeting ended? Dean Mercer was called next. He walked to the witness chair like a man carrying his own collapse. Under initial questioning, he repeated the preliminary fire report. Electrical origin, possible negligence, accelerant, trace, uncertainty. Ethan approached with the breaker box photographs enlarged and time-stamped. Did you observe that the rear breaker cover had been removed before thermal failure? Mercer hesitated. It was damaged during fire spread. Ethan placed the recovered screw beside the image. Then explain why the screw was found intact 6 feet away, showing no thermal lock, meaning removal occurred pre-ignition. Mercer looked at the screw, then at Margaret, then finally at Judge Torres. His shoulders dropped. Because I left that out. The courtroom erupted in whispers until Judge Torres called order. Ethan stepped closer. Why Mercer's answer came slower than anyone expected. Because I was told not to escalate unless criminal investigators requested it. Told by whom? Mercer shut his eyes briefly. Margaret contacted me before dawn. She said this neighborhood could not survive scandal. Margaret stood instantly. That is a lie. But Mercer was already speaking faster now, years of professional caution collapsing under public oath. She said if the report stayed electrical county attention would move on. She said she'd handle insurance narrative through the board. Daniel tried to intervene, but Judge Torres stopped him. Did you see accelerant? Ethan asked. Mercer shook his head. No confirmed accelerant. Lab result was contamination possibility. I signed language stronger than evidence supported. Margaret's composure finally cracked. You weak coward, she snapped before realizing she had spoken aloud. The judge's expression hardened. Ethan requested admission of alley footage next. The grainy clip appeared on screen. Hooded figure entering rear fence carrying a canister reflective glove catching infrared glare. The frame froze as the figure turned slightly near exit. Rachel had enhanced the SUV logo overnight. Judge Torres leaned forward. Can the plate be identified? Not fully, Ethan said, but vehicle registration from HOA vendor logs shows one matching SUV assigned to private maintenance contractor Lane. Structural services hired by Willow Creek 2 weeks before the fire. He then produced the contractor invoice marked fence access adjustment and emergency perimeter consultation services never performed. Daniel's defense was collapsing too fast to structure. He attempted to distance Margaret personally from any contractor action, but Ethan had one final exhibit, a phone log from Reeves's board account showing a 1:31 a.m. call to Lane structural owner, followed by a 1:34 a.m. text from Margaret tonight. Rear access only. This time, even Daniel did not object immediately because there was nothing left to stabilize. Judge Torres looked directly at Margaret. "Do you deny sending this message?" Margaret remained silent for 3 full seconds, and in those seconds every resident in the room saw what power looked like when certainty left it. "I deny criminal intent," she finally said. "Intent is for investigators," Judge Torres replied. "But civil abuse and retaliatory misconduct are already evident." Helen Mercer, seated in the back row, began crying quietly. 2 Willow Creek residents who had never spoken publicly before stood and requested leave to submit prior penalty records from Margaret's board, illegal fines, access threats, forced landscaping removals, intimidation letters. Rachel wrote so fast her pen nearly tore the paper. Then came the final break. Colin Reeves' voice shaking asked permission to amend testimony. Granted. "There's another file," he said. "Margaret kept a reserve account off record. HOA funds paid Lane Structural for discretionary compliance operations 3 times in 2 years. Judge Torres asked, "Including this fire," Reeves whispered. "Yes." Margaret slammed her hand against counsel table. "You signed every transfer too," Reeves answered with sudden anger. "Because you said nobody ever fights back. That outburst shattered whatever remained of controlled defense." Judge Torres ordered immediate referral to County Fraud Division, suspended HOA Enforcement Authority pending emergency receivership review, and instructed sheriff deputies present to retain all submitted digital evidence for criminal processing. When deputies moved toward Margaret, not yet arresting her, but requesting she remain available, she turned toward Ethan for the first time that day with raw hatred stripped of polish. "You think law makes you untouchable?" she said. Ethan met her stare without raising his voice. "No. I wrote it because people like you always assume nobody will read it." Outside the courthouse, cameras exploded into motion as residents poured onto the steps speaking louder than they had in years. Rachel stood beside Ethan while deputies escorted board records into sealed evidence crates. Across the plaza, Dean Mercer sat alone on a bench, face buried in both hands, understanding his career had just ended, but perhaps something worse had been stopped. And as courthouse bells marked noon, Ethan looked toward the sky, not victorious, not relieved, only aware that justice had finally begun moving, and that after years of silence, Willow Creek had heard power answer under oath. When Margaret Holloway left the courthouse that afternoon, she no longer looked like the woman who had ruled Willow Creek through polished smiles, selective threats, and carefully staged authority. She moved between sheriff deputies without handcuffs yet, but stripped of the invisible force that had once made neighbors lower their eyes when she passed. Reporters followed her down the courthouse steps, voices colliding in sharp questions about fraud, illegal enforcement, and the off-record HOA account now frozen under county order. She said nothing. For the first time in years, silence belonged to her instead of everyone else. Ethan Caldwell remained near the top of the courthouse stairs while the crowd shifted below him like a tide finally changing direction. Residents who had avoided his gaze for months now approached carefully, uncertain whether apology belonged in words or simply in presence. Helen Mercer reached him first, holding both hands around a folded handkerchief as though it were the only thing keeping them from shaking. "I should have spoken sooner," she said, voice breaking. Ethan looked at her, kindly exhaustion softening the sharp edge he had carried through every hearing. "You spoke when it mattered." She nodded once, tears already forming. "Your father would have hated what they turned this place into." That sentence landed harder than anything said in court. Ethan had not heard anyone mention his father since the fire, and for a moment he saw him again, clearly standing on the unfinished porch decades earlier, hammer in hand, insisting that a house mattered only if people inside it could sleep without fear. Rachel Monroe stood nearby, closing her notebook, at last, though cameras still flashed around them. "County Fraud Division just confirmed they seized all HOA financial records," she said quietly. "Lane Structural's owner is already talking." Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "People talk when the first person stops lying." Rachel studied him for a moment. "And you? I'm still deciding whether I remember how to stop." She almost answered, then chose not to because both of them understood that winning in court did not rebuild what had burned. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to the property under a sky washed pale after 3 days of legal storm. The ruins looked different now, not less painful, but less haunted. County tape still crossed part of the lot, yet investigators had cleared enough space for him to walk safely toward the old chimney. The blackened mailbox lay where it had fallen, bent but recognizable, and he picked it up carefully, brushing ash from the metal flag his father once painted by hand every summer. Across the street, curtains moved openly now. Doors opened. A man from Lot 14 crossed carrying bottled water and said awkwardly, "If you need help clearing debris, I've got tools." Another neighbor followed 10 minutes later, offering lumber from a shed. By sunset, there were 6 people on the property, none speaking loudly, each lifting burnt timber as if participating in something half practical, half confession. No one mentioned Margaret. No one needed to. The absence of fear had already changed the air. Near dusk, Rachel sat on the tailgate of Ethan's truck reviewing one final article draft while he opened the metal document case again. The leather folder survived everything's smoke-darkened edges but intact. Inside, beneath legal drafts and hearing notes, he found one page he had not looked at since before Claire died, a handwritten amendment proposal. He never submitted a margin note beside it written by Claire during one of his late-night committee sessions years ago. Laws matter most when the people writing them still remember loss. He stared at that line until Rachel noticed the silence. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan handed her the page but said nothing. She read it, then folded it carefully and returned it without comment. Some griefs were too old to explain and too alive to ignore. 2 days later, county receivers formally suspended Willow Creek Homeowners Association pending criminal audit. Margaret Holloway was charged with fraud, conspiracy, evidence interference, and civil retaliation tied to unlawful property coercion. Dean Mercer resigned before disciplinary review began and submitted a sworn statement expanding the timeline further enough to trigger a separate inquiry into delayed emergency reporting. Colin Reeves negotiated cooperation and released years of hidden board transfers, revealing that Ethan had not been the first target, only the first one with enough legal memory to stop the machine before it consumed another family. But by then, public headlines mattered less to Ethan than the small sounds returning to his land hammer taps measured footsteps, boards being stacked for salvage. He refused offers from developers, refused relocation assistance, refused every suggestion that he should leave Willow Creek after what happened. Instead, he hired a local carpenter and insisted the new house begin with the old foundation stones that had survived the fire. "Keep the chimney," he said on the first morning construction began. "My father built that by hand." The carpenter nodded and built around it. Rachel visited often at first for updates later, without pretending every visit required journalism. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes documents from ongoing hearings, sometimes nothing except quiet company while evening settled over unfinished beams. One afternoon she arrived carrying a small cardboard box. Inside was the restored mailbox flag repainted red. "County evidence released it," she said. Ethan took it, turning the metal slowly in his hand. "You repaired it. I know someone who still believes old things deserve another chance." He looked at her, then really looked and saw not the reporter from years ago or the witness from court, but someone who had remained after everyone else finished telling the story. By early autumn, the new house stood where ashes once cooled. Smaller than before, simpler, built from reclaimed cedar and clean lines, with a front porch facing the same street that had once watched in silence. On the day the final beam went up, Helen Mercer arrived carrying a lemon pie she insisted Ethan's mother used to bake better. Children rode bicycles openly along the curb again. No one hurried indoors when his truck appeared. No one checked HOA notices because there were none left taped to doors. The clubhouse down the road remained closed. Windows covered its flag, removed its authority, reduced to locked files awaiting court orders. That evening, after everyone left, Ethan stood alone on the porch, holding the old mailbox door before mounting it beside the steps. The sunset spread copper across the rebuilt wood, catching the chimney stones in warm light. He placed the leather folder on a small table just inside the front entrance, not hidden anymore, not archived like a wound. On top of it, he laid Claire's handwritten page. Rachel arrived just before dark and found him there watching the quiet street. "Looks different," she said softly. "Feels different," Ethan answered. She leaned against the porch rail. "You know they're teaching part of your case in county legal workshops already." He gave a faint laugh. "That sounds unbearable. You exposed how private power survives when nobody reads what they sign." "No," Ethan said after a pause, eyes on the road where neighbors now walked without hesitation. "I exposed what happens when fear lasts too long and one person finally decides not to inherit it." The evening breeze moved through the trees planted by his father decades earlier, trees that had blackened at the edges, but lived. Rachel looked toward the rebuilt home, then toward him. "So what now?" Ethan rested one hand against the porch post, feeling the grain of fresh cedar beneath his fingers. "Now," he said quietly, "I sleep in my own house again." And when night finally settled over Willow Creek, there were no sirens, no notices, no engines idling in the dark, only porch lights glowing one by one across the street, as if an entire neighborhood had finally remembered that law was never written to protect power, but to stop ordinary people from losing everything to those who mistake authority for ownership.